The one big one we had, which was really a tank-carrying glider, I thought quite reasonable flight characteristics, was the Hamilcar.
When the War Office began looking for a company to create a glider capable of carrying a light tank, General Aircraft Limited already had a design underway. Initial plans called for the tank to be embedded into the fuselage of the low-winged glider, with the tank's driver serving as pilot and the turret emerging from the airframe. This would allow the crew to fire on enemy targets from the moment the glider set down. However, the War Office felt that the design was too unconventional to undertake, so new plans would have to be drawn up. What emerged in early 1941 was a creation mainly constructed from wood and capable of carrying a light tank to the battlefield. Named the Hamilcar, it was to be tested as a half-scale prototype, which crashed on its first flight in September of 1941. Regardless of the accident, production of a full-sized prototype pushed forward, with a Handley Page Halifax pulling it into the skies. This is the saga of the flying tank. The trench. The Great War was defined by its use. Opposing armies settled in them across the battlefield from one another, a no-man's land of barbed wire and painful death separating one side from the other. This simple system of defense made the war a chess game, ensuring that each side waited for the opportune moment to strike in hopes of catching the enemy off guard. By the Great War's end, two inventions showed the promise of crossing over the no-man's land to inflict deadly attacks on the enemy lines, the tank and the aeroplane. With the Great War's end, the tank, a rolling fortress with violent power, was still struggling to overcome the difficult terrain that came with combat conditions. The airplane was still in its infancy and had not yet matured enough to be counted on as a truly decisive weapon. In the years ahead, however, both technologies would find their footing and grow into powerful tools for nations to exert themselves in the epic struggle to come. And what if these two vehicles could be merged into one? The striking power of a tank, with the ability to fly over obstacles like a plane. Truly, this would be the ultimate weapon of war. During the interwar period, it was becoming clear that wars would no longer be fought in the trench, and that developments in mechanized warfare would change the shape of the future battlefield. The seeds of these changes were sown during the Great War, when one nation boldly pushed forward with a new concept in armored vehicles.
Tanks had a nationality to begin with, and it was British. The British invented the tank, the so-called land battleship. They were the first to deploy it in battle. The British used it at the Battle of the Somme in 1916 in very, very small numbers. Everything went wrong at the Battle of the Somme, and so did the insertion of British tanks, which more or less sunk in mud up to their treads. But by 1917, the British were ready to use tanks en masse, and they did for the first time at the Battle of Cambrai. This battle, Cambrai was the brainchild, if you will, of JFC Fuller, a staff officer within the British Army, who had been interested in tanks from the very beginning. Fuller believed that tanks used en masse could achieve things on a World War I battlefield that infantry were incapable of doing. That is, getting across no man's land, crossing the enemy's first-line trench, silencing his machine guns, getting across the support trenches and then into the rear of the position, and even perhaps overrunning the artillery. All these things proved true in 1917. A use of perhaps 400 to 500 British tanks en masse on a small sector of the German front in front of Cambrai did something that had hardly happened at all in World War I, and that was sent German infantry running away in some terror and panic, throwing down their weapons and trying to flee. Now, that battle was essentially sterile in its ultimate strategic results, in that too many of the tanks broke down. The British were not able to sustain the momentum of their advance. But any thinking person knew that tanks were going to be playing a role in future warfare. And indeed, much of the interwar period is a great debate over just how tanks should be used. And that debate is taking place in every European nation and also in the United States as well, but certainly in Britain, in France, in Russia, Soviet Union in the 1920s, and also in Germany.
While during the Great War, the tank was not advanced enough to be seen as anything more than a vehicle to support the infantry, progress was being made to increase its viability to be a frontline weapon.
The era prior to World War II was one of great uncertainty in military affairs. There were new machines and they were being invented by the bucket load. Tanks had clearly improved. They were faster, sharper, and smarter in every way, and so were the aircraft. But no one had any real idea as to how all this would work together on a battlefield. The last conflict before World War II was the Spanish Civil War, and frankly, aircraft and tanks hadn't worked all that well. If you were to survey most informed opinion early in 1939 about the future of tanks, the answer that most informed opinion would give you is that anti-tank weaponry had caught up to the tank and it looked like it was going to stay that way for a considerable period of time. And just a few short months later, the German Wehrmacht would give the lie to those assertions.
With the commencement of hostilities in September of 1939, the tank begins to play a significant role in battles. Though France has tanks that are technologically superior to those of Germany, it is the Wehrmacht's use of quick movement and coordination by radios that helps them sweep through Western Europe. Now, with great distances separating Germany from its enemies in Great Britain and the Soviet Union, a great question remained. How does one move a large, heavy armored vehicle from bases to the front line in quick order? In the home of the tank, plans are being formulated. Great Britain's answer to the problem of transporting tanks to the battlefield would begin planning in 1940.
Well, at Farnborough, the main flight there was aerodynamics flight. And one of the sections attached to aerodynamics flight was airborne assault. So we tested the gliders, which the Army used for, obviously, airborne assault. And we had many of, well, virtually all of their gliders. We tested them for the pure flying characteristics. We tested them for their free flight characteristics. We also had to test them under tow, because they'd have to be towed in many occasions to the scene of the assault. And we got to know them pretty well. The one big one we had, which was really a tank-carrying glider of, I thought, quite reasonable flight characteristics, was the Hamilcar.
When the War Office began looking for a company to create a glider capable of carrying a light tank, General Aircraft Limited already had a design underway. Initial plans called for the tank to be embedded into the fuselage of the low-winged glider, with the tank's driver serving as pilot and the turret emerging from the airframe. This would allow the crew to fire on enemy targets from the moment the glider set down. However, the War Office felt that the design was too unconventional to undertake, so new plans would have to be drawn up. What emerged in early 1941 was a creation mainly constructed from wood and capable of carrying a light tank to the battlefield. Named the Hamilcar, it was to be tested as a half-scale prototype, which crashed on its first flight in September of 1941. Regardless of the accident, production of a full-sized prototype pushed forward, with a Handley Page Halifax pulling it into the skies. To give the most amount of space possible in the cargo compartment, the Hamilcar had its wings and cockpit set at the top of the fuselage. Its mainly wooden construction, with steel reinforcement beams, allowed it to carry a load of 17,600 pounds. During operations, the Hamilcar would be towed by a 4-engine bomber until close to its intended landing zone. At a low altitude, it would be released by its towing aircraft and make a steep descent at a standard approach speed of 100 miles per hour. The Tetrarch light tank, or M22 Locust, nestled tight within the Hamilcar's cargo bay, would start its engine just before landing, the tank crew already inside their vehicle. Once the glider set down, the tank driver would release the anchorages holding his vehicle in place, open the door, and ride out onto the battlefield. The Hamilcar suffered production problems from the start. The poorly organized General Aircraft Limited could never meet the number of gliders that they had promised to the War Office. By D-Day, only 80 Hamilcars were ready to take part in the invasion. Eventually, 344 were produced and took part in 3 missions, carrying tanks, supplies, and anti-tank guns into the battlefield. Though they worked quite well, they were large and slow and proved to be easy targets for anti-aircraft fire, causing many to be lost or damaged during the operations. The Hamilcar's design was a practical approach to the problem of moving tanks onto the battlefield. But Leslie Everett Baines would come up with a concept to do away with much of the complexity of housing them within a glider, by turning the tank into a glider itself. This design, undertaken in 1941, would rely on a glider with a 100-foot wingspan. The swept wings ended at a pair of vertical stabilizers on their tips. Baines suggested a method whereby the glider wings mounted onto the tank, which became the fuselage of the glider. Once the glider was detached from its towing aircraft, it would descend toward the battlefield, its engine started in the air so that it could move the moment it hit the ground. After settling on the ground, the tank would detach the glider wings and head off into battle. In 1943, work began on a 1/3 scale prototype of the proposed glider, named the Baines Bat. A small nacelle was added to the design in order to accommodate a pilot. Built entirely of wood, the Bat had flaps nearing the end of its wings. To save on weight, the Bat and its proposed full-sized version would have no tail. Could the British attempt at mounting a set of wings directly onto a tank be the best way to make it fly? This miniature glider version intended to find out. By mounting a set of wings directly onto a tank, British engineer Leslie Everett Baines hoped to fly the armed vehicles directly into the battlefield. But could the miniature test model, the Baines Bat, safely take to the sky and land in one piece? At under 4.5 feet tall, the scale prototype is tiny compared to the Miles Master Mark II, set to tow it into the skies. The main test pilot of the Baines Bat, Flight Lieutenant Robert Kronfeld of the RAF, found the handling to be well balanced and responsive. First flying in July of 1943, the Baines Bat had a maximum speed of 120 miles per hour and a cruising speed of 80 miles per hour. While tests of the Baines Bat are successful, it is decided that production of the full-scale glider will not go ahead. With an expected carrying weight of 8.5 tons, there just aren't any tanks suitable to be carried by such a device.
I thought, frankly, it was an impractical idea. And it was supposed to be attached to a tank, carry a tank. Of course, this was only a 3rd scale model we were flying. And obviously nothing near more than a tank was carried with it. But it flew so badly, its flight characteristics were so poor under these conditions, the thought of it carrying a tank, frankly, made the mind boggle. I think it was a totally impractical idea. To make it fly decently with a load like this aboard was a huge challenge, because if you have that amount of weight aboard, it very much affects your control forces. And to produce forces that would allow the pilot to maneuver for landing while carrying such a load aboard, I think was a very big challenge.
While the British did not have much luck in adding wings to a tank, Austrian-born engineer Raul Hafner was working with the British Air Ministry to create another method that might see a tank take to the air, using rotor blades. In the 1920s, Hafner devised a system of rotor hub design that allowed a pilot to adjust the collective pitch of the rotors, as well as the cyclic pitch. As the war began, he finds himself working to create a device that will allow British Special Forces to land behind enemy lines more precisely than with parachuting. This creation, the rotachute, would allow a single operative to glide safely to the ground. Though it never went beyond the testing phase, its promise pushed Hafner to consider getting larger vehicles airborne. Plans were made for a Rotabuggy, a jeep that could fly, followed by a rotatank, a modification that would allow a Valentine tank to make it into the air. In 1942, a contract was placed to develop the Rotabuggy using the standard Willis Jeep as a base. A rotor spanning 48 feet in diameter was fitted onto the unit, on a faired pylon above the fuselage. The rear sported a horizontal tail and two rudderless vertical stabilizers. It wasn't just a 500-kilogram Willis Jeep anymore. It also held the weight of the rotor and tail unit. The Rotabuggy was now a whopping 1,400 kilograms. The plan was that a Rotabuggy with a crew of 2 and various supplies would be towed aloft by a suitable transport plane. The driver of the Jeep would now be in the skies above enemy lines, so he could utilize the controlled rotor to manage the vehicle's descent onto more or less the desired landing point. The first test flight took place on November 16, 1943. Towed behind a Whitley bomber, the Rotabuggy glided at about 105 miles per hour, to the surprise of many. Although it was a shaky ride, with the Jeep's crew encountering a great amount of turbulence and uncontrollable vibrations, the resilience of the vehicle proved itself. Modifications were made and about 60 such test flights were executed. Small improvements in handling were made with each trial until the Rotabuggy was rated as highly satisfactory, after being released from the Whitley's cable and flying for 10 minutes at 400 feet. At the same time, all of its test runs were made at low altitudes, as the unit never instilled a resounding sense of confidence in its makers. Hafner and his team still thought the lives of the crew would be in jeopardy if they attempted to go any higher. At this point, all bets were off for the Rota tank. Although it was the next logical step up from the Rotabuggy, where a massive 155-foot diameter rotor would be fixed atop a standard Valentine tank, the project was abandoned. The rotor was actually built, and was quite possibly the largest of its kind in the entire world. While its enemies had built their tanks to be light, mobile, and maneuverable, Germany's approach would evolve as the war went on. Their initial instincts would have them harken back to their past for the strategies with which to wage war.
What the Germans were trying to do was to employ new machines, new technologies, but to employ them in the service of a very, very old way of war that had served them well in previous conflicts and they felt would continue to serve them well in the future. I think this sets the Germans somewhat apart from neighboring countries in the 1920s and 1930s in that they are not truly looking ahead as much as they are looking back to their old traditions and grafting new technologies onto them. Germany was officially disarmed by the Treaty of Versailles. So from 1918, as a result of losing the war from 1918 to 1933, the Germans were not able to produce the weapons they would like to have produced. It was against the law. It would have been a violation of international law, in particular the Treaty of Versailles. Now, when Adolf Hitler comes to power in 1933, international law and the maintenance of treaties is not uppermost on his mind, and the Germans are able to go into full-scale tank production. But we have to remember that there was a missing 15 years, an empty 15 years, and you just don't make that up overnight. As a result, for simply talking on a machine level, when World War II broke out in 1939, of course, it was the time and place of Germany's choosing, and especially Hitler's choosing, Germany's tanks were in many cases inferior to those of their adversaries. In German, the term for tank is Panzerkampfwagen, and so it's often abbreviated PZKW. There were two principal models in the German army at the outbreak of war. One was the PZKW-1 and then the PZKW-2. The one was a tiny machine equipped with a couple of machine guns in the turret. It did not even have a main gun that is firing explosive rounds. The PZKW-2 had a 20-millimeter gun, a pop gun in the turret. These were not the later armored behemoths, the Panthers and Tigers that would make the Wehrmacht famous in from 1943 to 1945.
These light tanks make up the backbone of the German invasion of Poland in 1939. But their weakness causes them to pay a high price. Almost a third of the vehicles are destroyed or damaged during the 5-week campaign. And though they are a key component again in the invasion of France, their time is drawing thin. German industry begins to produce larger tanks with heavier armament and fierce cannons.
This is the Tiger, probably the most feared tank of the Second World War, due largely to the fact that its gun was powerful and accurate, and with thick armour, 100 millimeters thick on the front, virtually indestructible. Against that, it has certain problems. One is there were never enough of them, about 1,300 all told. Secondly, the armour means tremendous weight. And on the soft going, found especially in a Russian spring when the thaws set in, these things will wallow in the mud and bog down easily. The other problem is purely a gunnery one. This gun is so big and powerful that it is quite unable to fire while the tank is on the move. If it did, it would literally rip itself out of the turret. So whenever the crew of a Tiger want to aim and fire, the Tiger must first stop, unlock the gun, aim it and fire it. So that is a serious problem from the tank crew point of view if it's in a melee, a mixed sort of fight, when everyone's dashing around shooting at everyone else.
Due to the size and weight of their tanks, Germany could not approach the problem of moving tanks through the air the same way as the British forces had. To move a giant tank, you need a giant aircraft. A task that their current frontline transport aircraft, the Ju-52, is not capable of. With a capacity to carry just 18 soldiers or 14,000 pounds of freight, new, larger capacity transport aircraft will be needed for the battles ahead. The Technical Bureau of the Luftwaffe issues a call for a large capacity transport glider to Junkers and Messerschmitt. In just 14 days, the Luftwaffe wants them to return with the designs for a glider capable of carrying an 88mm gun and its tractor, or a medium tank. Just 5 days after turning in the designs, both Messerschmitt and Junkers are asked to produce double the amount of gliders originally expected, 200 of each kind. Junkers takes the opportunity to design a unique aircraft that moves far from convention. The Ju-322 Mammoth will resemble a giant wing, massive clamshell doors in the front of which will allow the storage of cargo, personnel, and equipment inside the wings. It is expected to be capable of carrying 20,000 kilograms, including a medium tank, and would have 3 machine gun turrets for defense. After a Panzer III falls straight through the Mammoth's floor, Junkers reworks the design to add reinforcement, which reduces the payload weight of the Mammoth to 16,000 kilograms, then 11,000 kilograms, making it unlikely that it will ever carry a German tank. With a wingspan over 200 feet, the glider has its maiden flight in April of 1941. While that flight is nearly a disaster, once loose from the towing aircraft, the Mammoth flies well. However, in May, the Luftwaffe cancels the project, and the remaining wooden prototypes under construction are cut up to be used for fuel. While Junkers struggles to build the prototype of its flying wing glider, Messerschmitt charges full steam ahead on their design, named the Gigant. It will take an army of workers to get the task done, dozens of men needed to put together each of the Gigant's enormous wings. Built around a framework of steel tubing, wooden spars must be attached all along the 180-foot wingspan to create the wings. It is a monumental task to build each Gigant. Meter upon meter of doped fabric is required to cover the wings, each aligned carefully and hammered into place. The final glider, standing over 20 feet high, can carry 23 tons and has 6 times the capacity of the Junkers 52, and enough space to accommodate 120 fully equipped soldiers. In just 14 weeks' time, the first Gigants are ready to be taken into the sky. Though production moves along, the question of how to tow such a behemoth remains unanswered. It is found that the Ju-90 is not nearly powerful enough to pull the Gigant into the air with a minimal ballast. So how can a fully loaded glider of this size make it off the ground? One possible solution is to use 3 Bf-110s, towing the Gigant by 10mm steel cables. This arrangement, called the Troika-Schlepp, is incredibly dangerous, with risk of collisions between the towing aircraft during takeoff. Rocket-assisted takeoff was also attempted, but it was thought that the best solution might be to create a 5-engined aircraft capable of towing the Gigant on its own. The result is the Heinkel HE-111Z, a so-called Zwilling design, with the fuselages of 2 Heinkel 111s attached together. Even this specially designed aircraft fails to pull a fully loaded Gigant glider into the air. The Gigant did not live up to its promise of carrying troops and tanks into combat on the Eastern Front. Even when being towed by 3 Bf-110s, the Gigant would not be able to travel more than 400 kilometers. Some were eventually given 4 French-built motors and designated the Me-323. They still required assistance from the Heinkel 111Z or the Troika Schlepp to get into the air when fully loaded. With the Gigant not living up to expectations, Germany stayed out of the game of attempting airborne invasions. Operations requiring heavy lifting would be abandoned in the battles ahead.
Well, the whole idea of bringing support to foreign troops is something that the Germans were interested in, although they used recoilless guns and artillery. The idea of using tanks, the Germans were not too much into that. But then you have to keep in mind that after 1941 and Crete, the Germans did not really get into large airborne invasions. They had suffered heavy losses and they were on the defensive anyway, so the concept of a flying tank for them was not all that important.
2 drastically different approaches to building the tank and getting it into the air met a similar fate. Great Britain's small and nimble tanks, while a likelier candidate than anything else to be able to fly, remain on the ground. The Hamilcar's promising approach to the problem of getting a tank airborne is met with the harsh realities of taking slow transport gliders into battlefields filled with anti-aircraft fire. Germany's monster gliders to carry monster tanks failed by not taking into account the sheer magnitude of the task at hand. Could the Soviet Union succeed where these other nations failed? Though both Great Britain and Germany had failed to find a suitable and safe way to lift a tank into the air and land it on a battlefield, the Soviet Union would try their own methods. Could they succeed where these more technologically advanced nations had failed? The answer to that question begins not in the Soviet Union, but in the United States. While the tank was in use by all of the major forces by the end of the Great War, its design would evolve greatly in the interwar period. Many of the greatest innovations that would come from the mind of one man, John Walter Christie. Born in New Jersey, Christie cut his teeth as an engineer working on steamships and submarine designs. He then turned his attention to the automobile, where he developed a front-wheel drive system that he took as a driver to many prominent races, before developing a fire engine that finally replaced the need for horses pulling in steam-powered pumps in 1912. It was at this point that Christie would face his biggest obstacles to success, a combination of red tape and pride. In 1916, with the Great War raging, he submitted to the U.S. Ordnance Board his designs for a wheeled gun carriage. When the Ordnance Board asked for changes so that the vehicle could match their requirements, Christie balked at their demands. He would later cave into one criticism, that his designs lacked good cross-country performance, and turned this into one of his greatest achievements, the Christie suspension system. After 5 years of research and development, Christie presented a new design to the Ordnance Board, the M1928. With large wheels beneath its removable tracks that were capable of driving on roads, the M1928 promised to travel long distances at high speeds. The lightweight armor was angled at the tank's front, and much thinner than most traditional tanks. Most revolutionary is that each of the wheels had their own spring-loaded assembly, allowing them to move individually. The system was intriguing, and the Ordnance Board offered to purchase several prototypes and the patent for his suspension system. Promising as this is, the good news doesn't last long for Christie. As the Army evaluates the tank, they are less and less impressed with his tank's designs. They see tanks as supporting the infantry with strong shielding and immense striking power. Christie sees the tank as a frontline unit of its own, racing quickly across enemy territory and striking fast. His tank's armor can't even deflect projectiles from the smallest of anti-tank weapons. This clash of thinking leads to more heated words between Christie and Army officials.
The United States government was certainly interested in various aspects, and of course sprung suspension in one form or another will be a feature of all later tanks in the Second World War. But the Ordnance Board was concerned with a couple of items in Christie's tanks, and especially the extremely expensive acquisition cost. The lone wolf inventor is not able to achieve economies of scale. He can invent something, but even churning out a prototype for Christie was a very, very expensive proposition. It is often said that the Ordnance Board was not interested because Christie's tanks went too fast, and we sometimes laugh at that. But of course, miles per hour is not what tanks are all about. If they were, then you'd just get a sports car out there and load a machine gun on it. It's about operational mobility, and there were some very, very serious questions about whether Christie's relatively light tanks could stand up to the pounding.
Before long, it becomes unequivocally clear the U.S. Army will not purchase Christie's M1928 tank design. Frustrated, Christie looks outside of his country's borders for another country willing to purchase his creation. He does this without approval from the U.S. government, a bold and potentially dangerous move. The Polish are interested, and he brokers a deal to sell them his tanks, but reneges and refunds their deposit. Great Britain licenses his designs, which leads to the creation of the Cruiser Mark III. He is also approached by Soviet buyers, who he sells 2 of his tanks to, removing their turrets and proclaiming them tractors. With access to Christie's amazing innovations, the Soviets create the BT tank, the predecessor to the legendary T-34.
This is the Soviet T-34, arguably the finest tank of the Second World War. And one of the reasons it was so successful was the suspension system, which oddly enough was not Russian. The tank uses a system of suspension devised by an American engineer named Christie. It involves large diameter road wheels, large coil springs, in this case hidden behind the armour, which gives each wheel a tremendous amount of free movement as the tank roars across country. What that means in fighting terms is that the tank is more comfortable for the crew than a lot of its contemporaries, and what the army would call a steadier gun platform. So it makes it easier to shoot on the move with some hope of hitting something.
As we think back to World War I and we look at the British tanks of that conflict, they were essentially unsprung. It was an extremely rough ride and extremely unsettling to the tank crew. So something as technological and as specific as the suspension has a lot to do with crew morale, crew operability, the ability of the crew to take that tank on long cross-country drives as opposed to 300 or 400 yard jaunts across no man's land into the enemy trench. And I think had a lot to do with the improved range of tanks in the course of the period between the 2 world wars.
The other outstanding feature of T-34 is the use of sloped armour. This was very much an innovation in its day. The advantage of sloped armour is that it's weight saving. You're actually using thinner plate at an angle rather than thick plate vertically. And you can, by angling the plate at about 30 degrees, get double the effective thickness of the plate you're using. That's weight saving, obviously, and it does actually provide a bit more room inside because you can find room inside to put your legs. The other feature is that being angled, and again this is pure theory, an incoming round should strike and bounce off rather than penetrate. But that only works if tanks meet absolutely square on a perfectly level battlefield. That doesn't happen very often. As good as the T-34 is, the biggest asset the Russians had was quantity. Of the T-34 alone, they built over 60,000 during the war, which is more than I think Britain and Germany could muster together, which will tell you something. And I don't care what anyone says. In the end, it is quantity that tips the scales. It's quantity that will win, especially if they're in the hands of brave and quite ruthless people. The general impression is that Soviet tank crews were a darn sight more ruthless than the majority of their Western counterparts. It is said in any case that the fighting on the Eastern Front was of a kind quite terrible compared with what any of our people were used to. And it meant that the Russian crews, I won't say they were more dedicated, that would be wrong, but they were certainly a lot more ruthless in their whole attitude to war.
Just as the idea of Christie's suspension system and other innovations influenced Soviet designs, another of Christie's ideas for tanks may have found its way into their laboratories. Not long after developing his suspension system and revolutionizing the way the tank moved across the ground, J. Walter Christie had another idea: to move the tank across the sky. In July of 1932, Christie showed off his latest idea to the magazines Popular Mechanics and Modern Mechanics and Inventions. They chronicled Christie's vision of a new tank, one that he proclaimed would bring about an end to war because the weapon was so frightening. This bold vehicle would consist of a 4-ton, lightly armored body on a base of 8 wheels that featured his infamous suspension system. He boasted of a 75mm gun, several machine guns, and speeds of up to 70 miles per hour over rough terrain. And the pièce de résistance was a pair of wings mounted across its back that would allow it to take to the air like an airplane, powered by a 100-horsepower engine. The 2-man tank crew could fly into the battlefield, land, shed their wings, and roll across enemy territory. While Christie boldly claimed that his flying tank was ready to take to the skies in 1932, the truth was that it never made it off the ground.
Whether or not anything was actually built, the wings that is, the tanks existed, but the wings that is very doubtful.
One design for a flying tank that would drop right down on top of you, 75mm gun blazing, has to be entered into the realm of fantasy. But certainly we can't say that Christie was a crackpot. What he was a lone wolf designer going up against increasingly stiff competition from very large and well-heeled corporations which could hire dozens of J. Walter Christies.
But in the following years, the Soviets had tried many ways of getting tanks onto the battlefield, and perhaps there was something to Christie's notion, not necessarily to make the tank an airplane, but as a glider.
It was a simple idea, was to build a set of biplane wings, attach the wings to the body of a tank, tow the tank, drop the tank, and land the tank. Of course, you needed to take off, so you're looking at a tank that would be rolling around at something like 90 clicks to 100 clicks, flying, and then landing. It's a question, would they actually start the engine and run the tracks before landing, sort of lessen the blow? Whether or not the prototype actually left the ground, that I'm not sure. I've read sources that mention they ran it on the ground, but the thing simply wouldn't lift. Or they couldn't go fast enough, or the driver got nervous, so the tanks simply shed their tracks.
Some reports indicate that the Soviets' attempt at a gliding tank did indeed fly, in September of 1942. It was to be towed by a 4-engined heavy bomber, the Tupolev TB-3. A T-60 light tank is selected, weighing just under 6 tons. With a set of biplane wings emerging from its back, the tank is pulled along as the bomber rose into the air. So far, the plan seems to be working. Conceived by designer Oleg Antonov, if the plan works, such tanks could be dropped behind German lines to supply partisan forces with the means to strike harder than with infantry alone. This amazing feat of getting a tank airborne may be overshadowed if the glider cannot remain aloft. As they move through the air, the pilot in the tank struggles to keep his glider steady. It lurches back and forth, pulling on its tow cable. The immense weight and drag causes the bomber's engines to overheat. As the situation becomes graver, the pilot of the bomber must make a choice: risk his own life and aircraft in order to continue the flight, or cut the tank loose so soon after takeoff. Was mounting wings onto a light tank a deadly decision for the Soviet aircrew tasked to tow it into the air? Will the tank be able to fly on its own, or will it plummet to the earth below? After pulling a winged Soviet T-60 tank into the air, the Tupolev bomber towing it has had its engines overheat as the tank lurches back and forth, tugging on its tow cable. The pilot of the bomber has a decision to make. Does he risk his crew's life as he tries to wrestle the flailing tank into submission, or cut it loose and let the crew in the tank fend for themselves? With no time to spare, he chooses the latter option. With the tow cable released, the tank drops, but the pilot inside keeps it level, gliding it steadily toward the earth below. Taking it over a field, he hits the ground for a rough landing. With the flight concluded, he detaches the biplane wings and drives the tank safely back to base. The Antonov A-40 project is abandoned after one test flight. The hope of sending many of these tanks through the air into heavy combat situations remains nothing more than a dream. Germany will not have to fear an invasion of deadly Soviet flying tanks. It was at this that J. Walter Christie's flying tank idea met its end. The viability of putting such a creation into the air was too risky a venture. The task of routing the Wehrmacht and crushing the Nazi regime under their boot was well in place as the war progressed. Exotic weapons would not be needed to accomplish a task that sheer numbers and a ruthless desire to win could solve. While Christie's designs and concept had a great influence in the Soviet Union, the one place he didn't have success was at home.
Christie never did sell a tank design to the United States Army. He became increasingly embittered at that fact, and rejection followed rejection in the course of the late 1930s and well into World War II. And he died in January of 1944, nearly broke. He had sunk every penny, literally, he'd made in the business back into his own prototype designs, which went unsold. Now, at the same time, perhaps he could have looked around and derived some satisfaction from watching all those tanks driving around all those battlefields with suspensions very much approaching the one he had invented and with sloped armor.
J. Walter Christie died at the age of 78. Even as America entered into the war in 1941, he continued to push new tanks to them in hopes of securing a contract. With manufacturers as large as Chrysler getting into the tank building business, his chances of securing a contract were slim.
Where I see Christie as important is this vanishing figure in American history, and it is the figure of the lone wolf inventor, the Thomas Edison type. We live in a world today where by and large, inventions are the result of teams of researchers and scientists and technicians working on a problem. Now, as we look at recent developments, the closest I could get to a J. Walter Christie in the modern age would be Jobs and Wozniak inventing the home computer in their garage. Today, the American military, of course, has a gigantic transport aircraft, a C-5A, whose design specifications call for it, in fact, to be able to carry a single main battle tank. Now, the tank does not fly in action. The aircraft has to land. But nevertheless, the notion of airborne armor is perhaps not quite as crackpot as some have made it.
In fact, while America did not put any effort into making a tank fly or transporting one by air during the war, it would create those capabilities soon afterward, with the first aircraft to carry the name Globemaster. The original Globemaster, built by Douglas Aircraft, had its first flight days after the war's end, September 5th of 1945. With only 14 built, the C-74 made contributions to the Berlin airlift and the Korean War. Lessons learned in transporting supplies to Berlin led to the creation of its successor, the Douglas C-124 Globemaster II. During the early 1950s, it successfully did what no other aircraft of its time could do: carry tanks and other heavy equipment without the need for disassembly. Lockheed followed suit in the creation of large, heavy-lift transports with the C-130 Hercules. Capable of hauling a 45,000-pound payload, the Hercules first flew in 1954, and while it was originally created to move troops, take part in medical evacuations, and transport cargo, it has since been used for many more tasks. It has the distinction of having the longest continuous production run of any military aircraft, over 50 years straight, and is operated by over 60 countries. Most notable is its ability to swoop down low to the ground and drop a tank out of its cargo bay without landing. While not the method of delivery that Christie and others dreamed of, it can place armored vehicles into the field quickly. The Hercules was followed by a third aircraft to carry the Globemaster moniker, the Boeing C-17. It can carry a 69-ton Abrams tank and is set to carry the armor of the future, the ground combat vehicles currently under development. These massive aircraft follow in the footsteps of Messerschmitt's Gigant in bringing tanks across vast distances for a ground invasion. But there has been little in the development similar to the Hamilcar or the Baines Bat, vehicles used to carry tanks directly into battle. Was such an idea too far-fetched to pursue in the years following the war?
There's theoretically nothing stopping us from having a flying tank, but real constraints in the 1920s and 1930s would include the lack of an aircraft powerful enough to carry the tank, the lack of a power plant powerful enough to power that aircraft, logistical constraints, command and control constraints. That is, we fly our tanks 400 miles forward and we drop them. Tanks have immensely large logistical requirements. They require a convoy of trucks to supply them with oil and gasoline. Those trucks require another convoy of trucks to supply them with oil and gasoline. And the notion of a far-flung airborne operation without its own logistical pipeline back to the main base in the 1920s and 1930s rendered it extremely unlikely.
While technology has progressed to make the flying tank a possibility in the modern world, those same constraints of a supply line remain today. Sending flying tanks into the battlefield remains nothing more than a fanciful concept, one perhaps surpassed by newer technologies that make such a weapon unneeded.
Messerschmitt Me 321 Gigant. When Nazi Germany planned the invasion of Britain, they faced a massive logistical hurdle: how to move tanks, artillery, and hundreds of troops across the Channel quickly. The answer was the Messerschmitt Me 321 Gigant, an aircraft built on a truly monstrous scale. This wasn't a conventional plane, it was a glider, the largest ever deployed in the war. Constructed primarily of steel tubing, wood, and fabric to conserve strategic metals, Gigant featured massive clamshell doors in the nose, allowing it to swallow a Panzer IV tank or over 130 fully equipped soldiers. But its sheer size created a massive problem: getting it off the ground. It was too heavy for any single standard Luftwaffe aircraft to tow. This led to the desperate and incredibly dangerous Troika-Schlepp method, where 3 Messerschmitt Bf-110 fighters would attempt to tow the giant simultaneously, a maneuver that frequently ended in fatal collisions. Rocket-assisted takeoff units were often strapped under the wings to help. Eventually, the specialized 5-engined Heinkel HE-111Z Zwilling was developed specifically for the task. While the Me-321 saw service on the Eastern Front, these massive, slow-moving gliders were easy targets for enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire, leading to heavy losses and the eventual development of the powered Messerschmitt Me-323.